Hi everyone, this is DM Yeknam from House Rule Gamers once again. Today's video we're going to be discussing proficiencies and the optional rules that come with them. So here we're going to discuss proficiencies, which are found in Chapter 5 of the AD&D 2nd Edition Player's Handbook. It's important to begin this with the understanding that proficiencies are optional and they're not necessary for your game. Your gaming table, your gaming group needs to decide whether or not they are in use. Non-weapon proficiencies were introduced in several books from the AD&D First Edition game, and weapon proficiencies were introduced in the AD&D First Edition Player's Handbook, but they are still considered optional in the Second Edition game. Weapon proficiencies, if used, should apply equally to both player characters and non-player characters. And non-weapon proficiencies, while an option, not a must-have or a rule as written that you must follow, do add an additional depth, an additional level to characters and skills that they have outside of the combat and class and race, etc. So it is important to note that outside of extraordinary circumstances, once a proficiency slot is filled, it can never be changed or reassigned. So even first level characters have proficiencies. The number of proficiency slots that a character starts with is determined by their grouping. As you can see here on table 34, our groupings are warrior, wizard, priest, and rogue. Each proficiency slot is empty until the player fills it by selecting a proficiency. Using non-weapon proficiencies, the character's intelligence score, which we will talk about in a moment, can modify the number of slots that you have, granting more proficiencies. In both cases, new proficiencies are learned the same way. Let's take the case of Wrath, a dwarven fighter. Table 34 gives 4 weapon proficiency slots to Wrath, because Wrath is a warrior. If non-weapon proficiencies are used, Wrath has 3 slots because of his grouping and because of Wrath's intelligence, and 11, 2 additional proficiency slots would be gained for a total of 5 non-weapon proficiency slots. The player must assign weapon or non-weapon proficiencies to all of these slots before the character goes on their first adventure. These represent what the character has learned before beginning their adventuring career. Thereafter, as the character advances in experience levels, the character gains additional proficiency slots. The rate at which these are gained depends on the group to which the character belongs. Table 34 lists how many weapon and non-weapon proficiency slots the character begins with and how many levels the character must gain before another slot is earned. So very quickly, the initial weapon proficiency slots is the number of weapon proficiency slots received by characters of that group at first level. So you see here the initial weapon proficiency slots. The number of levels for both weapon and non-weapon proficiencies tells how quickly a character gains additional proficiency slots. A new slot is gained at every level that is evenly divisible by the number. Wrath, our dwarven warrior, for example, gains 1 weapon proficiency slot at every level evenly divisible by 3. Wrath also gains 1 non-weapon proficiency slot at every level evenly divisible by 3. If Wrath were a rogue, Wrath would gain 1 weapon proficiency slot at every level evenly divisible by 4, and 1 non-weapon proficiency slot at every level evenly divisible by 4. Penalty is the modifier to the character's attack roll when they fight using a weapon they are not proficient in. This is highest for wizards and lowest for warriors, and priests and rogues have the same -3 penalty. Initial non-weapon proficiencies is the number of non-weapon proficiency slots that a character has at first level. Even if you are playing with weapon proficiencies, non-weapon proficiencies are optional. Let's very quickly just think about training in this regard. Like all skills and abilities, proficiencies do not leap unbidden and fully realized into a character's mind. Instead, a character must train, study, and practice to learn a new proficiency. However, role-playing the training time needed to learn a new skill is not always engaging or fun. Thus, there are no training times or study periods associated with any proficiency, When a character chooses a proficiency, it is assumed that this had been occurring in spare time, in the downtime for training. Consider just how much spare time that character has. The player is not role-playing every second of the character's life. The player may decide to have their character spend a night in town before setting out on the long journey the next day. Perhaps the character must wait around for several days while their companions heal from the last adventure. The character might spend weeks on an uneventful ocean voyage. What is going on during that time? Amongst other things, the character is studying whatever new proficiencies they will eventually learn. Using this downtime to handle this unexciting aspect of a role-playing campaign lets players concentrate on more important and more interesting matters. Sometimes it may be important to the game or to the role-playing aspect to seek out a specific trainer of a specific skill, but these are far and few between and generally are something that is agreed upon by the group and the dungeon master as an engaging aspect of role-playing. Another part of training is, of course, finding the teacher. Most skills are easier to learn if someone teaches the character. So the DM can handle this simply by saying there is no need for the teacher, or individuals are self-taught. You can also make it to add another level of realism where specific instructors have to be found. Or you could, handle any combination of that. Whatever works best for your gaming table. All right, so let's quickly have a look at the intelligence and the number of languages here. This is table 4 from the ability scores section, which we discussed in a much earlier video. Very quickly, I want to bring everyone's attention to the number of additional languages based off of intelligence. If the DM allows characters to have proficiencies, this column indicates the number of extra proficiency slots characters gain due to their intelligence. These extra proficiency slots can be used however the player desires. The character never needs to spend any proficiency slots to speak their native language. So let's talk about weapon proficiencies and really what that is. A weapon proficiency measures a character's knowledge and training with a specific weapon. When a character is created, the player checks table 34 in the player's handbook to see how many weapon proficiency slots the character has. These initial slots must be filled immediately before the character embarks on their first adventure. Any slots that aren't filled by then are lost. Each weapon proficiency slot must be assigned to a particular weapon, not just a class of weapon. Later rules will adjust weapon classes, but those are rules that come from the Complete Fighter's Handbook and other such books. We will discuss those at a later point, but from the Player's Handbook, there is no such thing as a class of weapon. Each weapon listed in Table 44 of the Player's Handbook, which is the weapons listing, requires their own proficiency. Each has its own special tricks and quirks that must be mastered before the weapon can be handled properly and effectively. A fencer who is a master of the épée, for example, is not necessarily skilled with a saber. The two weapons look similar, but the fighting styles they are designed for are entirely different. A character could become proficient with a longbow or a short bow, but not with all bows in general, unless he devotes a proficiency slot to each individually. Furthermore, a character can assign weapon proficiency slots only to those weapons allowed to their character class. Specialty priests offer a variety of weapons. Warriors can learn all weapons. Wizards and rogues have a limited number of weapons that they can learn to use, whereas wizards have a truly limited number, mostly because of the time they spend studying the magical arts. Now, effects of weapon proficiencies. A character who is proficient in a specific weapon is skilled with that weapon and familiar with its use. A character does not gain any bonuses for a weapon they are proficient in. The combat rules and attack chances assume that everyone uses a weapon they are proficient in. This eliminates the need to add a modifier to every die roll during combat. When a character uses a weapon that they are not proficient with, however, they suffer a penalty on their chance to hit. The size of this penalty depends on the character's class. Warriors have the smallest penalty. because they are assumed to have passing familiarity with all weapons. Wizards, by comparison, have a heavy penalty because they are limited in the amount of time they use to study weapons. The modifiers are shown below on table 34, as you can see that just appeared on your screen. So let's discuss related weapon bonuses. When a character gains a weapon proficiency, that character is learning to use a particular weapon effectively. However, many weapons have similar characteristics. A longsword, bastard sword, and broadsword, while all different, are all heavy slashing swords. A character who is trained with one can apply some of the skill to the others, although they are not fully proficient with the weapon. They still know more about it than someone who picks it up without any skill in similar weapons. When a character uses a weapon that is similar to a weapon that they are proficient with, their attack penalty is only 1/2 the normal amount, rounded up. A warrior, for example, would have a -1 with a related weapon instead of a -2. A wizard would have a -3 penalty instead of a -5. Specific decisions about which weapons are related are left up to the DM, but some categories are likely to include those shown here. Weapon specialization. Knowing how to use a weapon without embarrassing yourself is very different from being a master of that weapon. There are warriors, and then there are martial artists. An Olympic fencer is more than just an athlete. They can do things with their weapon that astound most fencers. In the AD&D game, part of your character's skill is reflected in the bonuses they gain as they reach higher levels. As your character advances, they become wiser, more dangerous, a more capable fighter. Experience has taught them to anticipate their opponents and to pounce on any advantage that presents itself. But this is a general overall improvement brought about by the warrior's sharpening senses and timing. It applies equally to all types of fighting. Weapon specialization is an optional rule that enables a fighter, and a fighter only, a single classed fighter only, to become much more skilled with a specific weapon. I do want to add that certain rule supplements, specifically Specialty Priest and some of the so-called kits from the Complete Handbook series, alter this rule. These will all be discussed in later videos. The cost of specialization. When specialization is obtained by devoting extra weapon proficiency slots to the chosen weapon, to characterize this in sort of a melee weapon or crossbow, the character must devote 2 slots. 1 slot to become proficient with it, and then a 2nd slot to specialize in it. That's melee weapons and crossbows. Any bow other than a crossbow requires a total of 3 proficiency slots. 1 for proficiency, and 2 to specialize. Assume for the moment that Wrath the Dwarf decided to specialize in the Warhammer. 2 of Wrath's proficiency slots are thus devoted to the Warhammer. With the 2 remaining, Wrath could become proficient with a short sword or short bow, for example. Now, the effects of specialization. When a character specializes in a melee weapon, they gain a +1 bonus to their attack rolls with that weapon, and a +2 bonus to all damage rolls, in addition to bonuses for strength and magic. The attack bonuses are not magical, and do not enable a character to affect a creature that can only be injured by magical weapons. Bows and crossbow specialists gain an additional range category, point blank. Point blank range is for bows, and it is from 6 feet to 30 feet. Point blank range for crossbows is from 6 to 60 feet. At a point blank range, the character gains a +2 modifier on attack rolls. No additional damage is caused, but strength for strength bows and magical bonuses apply. Furthermore, if the character has an arrow knocked and drawn, or a boat locked and loaded, and his target is in sight, they can fire at the beginning of the round before any initiative rolls are made. Fighters who specialize also gain extra attacks earlier than those who don't specialize, as seen on table 35. The use of this table is fully explained in Chapter 9 Combat. We will get to Chapter 9 in one of our future videos. Now, a player character is more than really just a collection of combat modifiers. If that's what you want to break your character down into, you're welcome to do that. Most groups, however, enjoy more of the role-playing aspects. There's nothing wrong with combat, and combat can be viewed as a role-playing aspect of the game, especially if done correctly. But all characters are a collection of more than combat modifiers. Think of yourself. Most people have learned a variety of skills over the years. You may have gone through 12 years of school. You may have gone through university. You may have gone through postgraduate work. Or even if you didn't finish any of these schools, you still have a large list of things you have learned. You may have gone to a trade school. You may have learned things like English, reading and writing, a foreign language, geometry, algebra, trigonometry. You may have learned how to be a pipe fitter, a welder. You may have learned swimming, typing, driving, basic biology. You may be fluent in reading and writing of other languages as well. In addition to the things you learned in school, you also have things that you learned from your parents, your friends, your clubs, the scouts, whatever you were interested in. You could have learned basketball, you could have learned first aid, horseback riding, sewing. All of these are things that you could have learned, and you could have learned them at a relatively young age. Now, what have you learned after that time? What have you learned in your trade school or your university life or your postgraduate life? The amount of things that you know would truly amaze you if you created a list. Your character is no different. For a complete role-playing character, you should know what your character can do. There are 3 different ways to do this: using what you know, using secondary schools, and using non-weapon proficiencies. So if the using what you know option is in place, and your DM decides not to use secondary skills or non-weapon proficiencies, situations will arise in which you'll have to determine whether your character has certain skills. For example, Delsinora the wizard slips at the edge of a steep riverbank and tumbles into the water. The current sweeps her into the middle of the river. To escape, she must swim to safety. But does Delsinora know how to swim? One way to answer this is to pretend that your character knows most of the things that you know. This can be somewhat confusing if you yourself have a vast knowledge pool to draw from, and your character would not have a vast similar knowledge to draw from. But that's between you and your DM to discuss. But you could say if you know how to swim, then your character knows how to swim. If you know a little about mountain climbing, horseback riding, carpentry, or sewing, your character knows a little bit about these things too. This applies to things your character might want to build. It describes things your character may want to do. If you can show your DM how such a device or how such a thing can be built or done, then your DM may allow your character the same knowledge. Indeed, you could probably visit a local library or look up on the internet to see exactly how these things would be done, and you could share that with your DM and say that your character had learned it. There are real advantages to this method. You can learn something at the library or at school from the internet and bring it into your game. Also, there's less rules to get in the way of fun. You don't have secondary skills, you don't have non-weapon proficiencies, and your DM has a lot of flexibility and can play out all the drama inherent in a scene. There are also problems with this method. First, you probably know a lot of things, not probably, definitely know a lot of things your character should not. Basic electronics, the components of gunpowder, calculus, for instance. You may have a lot of knowledge that is just not available to someone in a fantasy medieval world. Likewise, there are things that a typical person in a fantasy medieval world would know that you, as a modern person, may have never learned. Do you know how to make armor? Can you skin a deer? Do you know how to salt meat away for the winter? Can you turn flax into linen? Can you thatch a roof? Can you read heraldic symbols? You might, but there is no way you can consider these common skills at this point in the 21st century. But in a medieval fantasy world, they would be common. Also, knowing something about a skill or trade doesn't mean you know a lot, and there is a big difference between the two. When Delsinora fell into the raging river, she had to swim out. But was she a strong enough swimmer to pull free of the current? The DM must make up a rule on the spot to handle the situation. Perhaps you can swim, but can you swim well enough to escape a raging torrent? The biggest drawback to this method is that there are no rules to resolve tricky situations. The DM must make such rules up during play. Some players and DMs enjoy this. They think up good answers quickly. Many consider this to be a large part of the fun, and this method is perfect for them, and they should use it. Other players and DMs like to have clear rules and guidelines to prevent disagreements and arguments. If this is the case in your group, it is better to use secondary skills or non-weapon proficiencies. The second method for determining what your character knows is to assign secondary skills. Secondary skills were introduced in a formal fashion in the first edition AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide, but even at that point they were considered optional rules. Secondary skills are very broad areas of expertise. Most correspond to occupations that your character may have been apprenticed in or otherwise picked up before beginning their adventuring life. Secondary skills are much more general than non-weapon proficiencies and should not be used in conjunction with non-weapon proficiencies, which we will explain later in this video. Every player character that is using a secondary skill must either choose one or take a chance and roll randomly. The random roll may result in one secondary skill, two secondary skills, or no secondary skills. Once a character has a secondary skill, it is up to the DM and the player to determine just what the character can do with it. The items in parentheses after each skill describe some of the things the character knows, but not all of them. Other knowledge may be added with the DM's approval. Thus, a hunter might know the basics of finding food in the wilderness, how to read animal signs to identify the types of creatures in the area, the habits of dangerous animals, and how to stalk wild animals. Very much like the previous method of using what you know, this method has strengths and weaknesses. Secondary skills do not provide any hard and fast rules or guidelines as to exactly when a character succeeds at something difficult. It is safe to assume that simple jobs succeed automatically. A hunter could find food for themselves with no difficulty. For more complicated tasks, the DM must assign a chance for success. He can assign a percentage chance, have the character make a saving throw, or require an ability check. The DM has a lot of flexibility here. This flexibility means the DM must sometimes make up the rule to cover the situation. As mentioned earlier, some DMs enjoy this, while others do not, their strengths being elsewhere. While secondary skills define and limit the player's options, they do not greatly simplify the job for the DM. So let's get to the most detailed aspect of knowing what skills a character has, that of non-weapon proficiencies. Like weapon proficiencies, each character starts with a specific number of non-weapon proficiency slots and earns more as they advance in levels. Initial slots must be assigned immediately. They cannot be saved or held in reserve. Non-weapon proficiencies are the most detailed way to handle what a character knows. They allow the character to choose from a broad selection and define the effects of each choice. Like the other methods, there's a drawback. With this one, the largest drawback is that non-weapon proficiencies are very rigid. They're exceptionally defined, and they limit the options of both the player and the DM within that proficiency. At the same time, there's always going to be unanswered questions about these proficiencies. Whereas before such questions were broad, they will now tend to be more precise and detailed. Secondly, using this system increases the amount of time needed to create a character. Whilst the end result is a more complete, well-rounded person, setup can take much longer, especially for novice players who are just really familiarizing themselves with the game rules. Unlike weapon proficiencies, in which some weapons are not available to certain character classes, all non-weapon proficiencies are available to all characters. Some non-weapon proficiencies are easier for certain character classes to learn, however. Table 37, which we'll see shortly in this video, shows a list of all non-weapon proficiencies. They are divided into categories that correspond to the character groups. The proficiencies listed under each group can be learned easily by characters of that group. A fifth category, General, contains proficiencies that can be easily learned by any character. Refer to Table 38 when a player selects a non-weapon proficiency from the categories under Proficiency groups for his character's group. It requires the number of proficiency slots shown on Table 37. When a player character selects a proficiency slot from any other category, it requires one additional proficiency slot beyond the number listed. Using non-weapon proficiencies. When a character uses a proficiency, either the attempt is automatically successful or there must be a proficiency check. If the task is simple and mundane, the proficiency really only has a limited use or something like that, or there's no real need for a check to determine this. There's no sense of danger in the game itself. There's no sense of risk if something has failed. Then there's no check required usually. If the task the character is trying to perform is difficult or subject to failure, a proficiency check is required. Read the descriptions of the proficiencies for details on how and when each can be used. If a proficiency check is required, Table 37 lists which ability is used with each proficiency. Add the modifier, either positive or negative, listed in Table 37 to the appropriate ability score. Then the player rolls 1d20. If the roll is equal to or less than the character's adjusted ability score, the character accomplished what the character was trying to do. If the roll is greater than the character's ability score, the character fails at the task. A roll of 20 always fails. The DM determines what effects, if any, accompany failure. Some skills may also only be rolled by your DM. Some DMs prefer to keep some skills a secret on whether or not they have succeeded, and they may roll the checks for the players themselves. Of course, to use a proficiency, the character must have any tools or associated materials needed to do the job. A carpenter can do very little without his tools. Someone can't do any writing without something to write with. The character must also have enough time to do the job. Some things like carpentry, you can't build a house in an entire day. Some proficiency descriptions state how much time is required for certain jobs. Most, however, are left to the DM's judgment. The DM can also raise or lower a character's chance of success if the situation calls for it. Factors that can affect a proficiency check include availability and quality of tools, quality of material used, time spent doing the job, difficulty of the job, location of the job, how familiar the character is with the task. A positive modifier is added to the ability score for the check. A negative modifier is subtracted from the ability score. Wrath, skilled as a blacksmith, has been making horseshoes for years. Because he is so familiar with the task and has every tool he needs, the DM lets him make horseshoes automatically without risk of failure. However, Delsinora has persuaded Wrath to make an elaborate wrought iron cage. She needs it to create a special magical item. Wrath has never done this before, and the work is very intricate, so the DM imposes a penalty of -3 on Wrath's ability check. When two proficient characters work together on the same task, the highest ability score is used. That is the one with the greatest chance of success. Furthermore, a +1 bonus is added for the other character's assistance. The bonus can never be more than +1, as having too many assistants is sometimes worse than having none. Non-weapon proficiencies can also be improved beyond the ability score the character starts with. For every additional proficiency slot a character spends on a non-weapon proficiency, that character gains a +1 bonus to those proficiency checks. Thus, Wrath, were he not an adventurer, might spend his additional proficiency slots on blacksmithing to become very good at being a blacksmith, gaining a +1, a +2, +3, or even a greater bonus to his ability checks. Many non-player craftsmen are more accomplished in their fields than player characters, having devoted all of their energies to a single proficiency. Likewise, old masters normally have more talent than young apprentices, unless the youth has an exceptional ability score. However, age is no assurance of talent. Remember that knowing a skill and being good at it are two different things. There are bad potters, mediocre potters, and true craftsmen. All of this has much less to do with age than with dedication and talent. Here you see Table 37. We have our general category, which is available to every grouping for the listed number of slots. We have our priest category, which is available to priest and perhaps some other classes for the listed number of slots. The same thing for rogues, the same thing for warriors, the same thing for wizards. If a wizard wished to learn endurance rather than costing 2 points, it would cost him 3 points. If a priest wished to learn tumbling, it would cost him 2 points rather than the 1 point you see listed for a rogue. Table 37 can be found in your AD&D 2nd edition Player's Handbook in Chapter 5. Well, we've come to the end of another video. And remember, when it comes to skills and knowledge, the expert in anything was once a beginner. I'm DM Yeknam for House Rule Gamers. Hoping you've enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you, and goodbye.